welcome to the first episode. I've got Amanda and Ryan on the call with me today, and I'm super excited to dive into a bunch of amazing stuff around mental fitness, digital nomads, and entrepreneurship. But to start us off, Amanda, I'd love to have you introduce yourself and what keeps you busy these days.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm Amanda and I'm really excited to be here, Fyfe. So thanks for having us. And I'm, I guess, one half of Amanda and Ryan. And I am a yoga teacher, a podcast host, and a world traveler or digital nomad. I'm working a lot with yoga teachers and yoga studio owners these days through my podcast, Mastering the Business of Yoga. And then I'm also 7 months pregnant at the moment. So currently growing a little human inside my body. So that's keeping me pretty busy.
Yeah. And where are you guys right now?
We're in a city in Mexico called Querétaro, which is about 2 hours north of Mexico City in central Mexico.
Nice. And how about for yourself, Ryan? I know you've just had a recent change in some of your work.
Yeah, so I have a couple things. So Amanda and I host together the World Wanderers podcast on our travels. And then I'm also the director of boot camp for a company called Praxis. The easiest way to describe it is a college alternative for people who want to quickly start their careers in business or are interested in entrepreneurship. We kind of help people over a 12-month span kickstart their careers. And I am kind of tasked with the education side of that process.
Awesome. And I'm excited to chat a bit more about that because I think it's a really cool alternative and way of thinking about getting into the workforce. But one of the key things I want to chat about on a lot of these interviews is weaving in mental fitness concepts. Both of you went through some programming with me, and we'll be talking about saboteurs and SAGE. So for anybody that isn't familiar with those terms, they are essentially kind of like archetypes of how we move through the world. Saboteurs specifically are kind of how we negatively motivate ourselves through negative emotions, which can also often lead to success. But there's some key archetypes, and those will come up throughout these calls. And before we dive in, just so there's some context setting, what are your top saboteurs, Amanda?
Yeah, so mine are restless, pleaser, and controller.
Yeah. And just
if you know me, those are very accurate.
Yeah. And just like really high level, like what does the restless look like for you? Like how does that show up? Just like a quick snapshot, just because I think it'll help provide some context.
Yeah, for sure. So the restless shows up for me in my desire to kind of plan and essentially like plan ahead and, have my weekends full of things to do and, my time off from work full of things to do. And I have a lot of projects on the go with work. So just having a lot on the go, I think is how my restless shows up. And then my pleaser very much shows up with like people pleasing. So when it comes to, speaking up for myself or maybe choosing something different from what other people think is right or kind of speaking against that. Like if there's a discussion going on in a group of people, my pleaser will definitely show up there. And then my controller shows up in many areas, relationships, personal, work, but just wanting to have things kind of like organized and controlled is definitely like where I feel safest.
Yeah. And how about for yourself, Ryan?
Yeah, I think like all the hyper ones were near the top of the list.
Yeah.
So a hyper achiever, hyper rational, and then I think it was avoider and then hyper vigilant were the ones right at the top.
Yeah.
Do you want me to kind of give a quick overview of what those are?
We'll kind of like tease those out as we go through as they come up. But I just wanted to set a bit of a context for myself. I have a high pleaser. Restless is definitely high. So I definitely connect with you, Amanda, on that. And stickler. So even just for this show, I said it even before we started recording, it's like, I want this to be perfect. I just want to have things just right. And I don't want to screw things up. So the reason why I wanted to set the stage with this stuff is as we dive into conversations, it'll be a really cool filter and lens to look at how you guys navigated things in the past, like becoming digital nomads, but also just current challenges that you guys are up against. And I want to weave that into the conversation and like model that too. So as it's coming up for me, as we're recording, I might kind of share some of that stuff, because it's a really present thing for everybody as they go through life. We're just not really aware of it that much, and how much impact it can have. So I really want to dive into this whole digital nomad stuff. A lot of people are working from home right now. That's been a big transition for a lot of people over the last couple of years. But you guys have made a very specific decision. I don't know how long ago, 8 years now?
I guess 2015 was when we 2015, 2016 is when we kind of made that transition.
Yeah. And how did you get to the point where you wanted to make that leap into being a digital nomad? Like what led you up to that point?
Yeah, for sure. So I think to kind of, get into that, I need to back up a little bit more and talk a little bit about kind of like, what our story and what led us to that. So after university, we went traveling for 6 months. We went to Europe and Southeast Asia and Australia. We had this sort of typical, post-university, pre-life gap year, which was amazing. We got to, see the world in this different way. And then we came back to Calgary in Alberta, where we were living at the time. And we got quote unquote, like big kid jobs and a big kid apartment. And we moved in together and we're just doing the adult thing, like on the conveyor belt, doing the adult life. And neither of us were really fulfilled with that. So in 2014, which was 2 years later from this, we decided to quit our jobs, sell our stuff, and go to South America for 6 months. And this was a little bit outside the norm because, we were like 24, 25 at this point. It's like, we have these good careers on paper. Our family and friends are like, what the heck are you doing? You've already done this. You don't get to do it again. And I think it was on that trip where we really recognized that we felt the most like alive and free while we were exploring the world. Yet, obviously, you have to pay your bills and you have to be able to pay for your travels. And careers can be really rewarding as well. So we kind of looked at like, what's the intersection of being able to explore the world while also making money, while also being able to have a fulfilling career. And I think for us, that was like the first time that we'd ever thought about maybe doing something like that.
Yeah. And just going back to that, you were doing the corporate thing and then it was like, we needed to go traveling again. What was that feeling leading up to the point where like, we need to go travel again? Because I think it's something that a lot of people come up against, whether it's a career change or doing something differently, but that like resistance or frustration point, like how did you know a change needed to happen?
Yeah, I think for both of us, because we'd had that experience right after university of taking a longer adventure and backpacking and exploring, and really just like feeling alive during that point of time, that became like a very like clear point of reference of like,
it's like a baseline.
Like, yeah, not a baseline, but just like almost like a goal of like, okay, life could be like this. And obviously, you can't be on vacation all the time, but you can be doing things that really like make you feel alive. And so we got back and we kind of went from like, this adventurous thing to very much like back on the conveyor belt, doing stuff. We hadn't approached our careers to that point with much self-direction. It was very much like, well, we went to university because that's what everybody was doing. And that was kind of our context of like, you finish high school, you go to university, and then you go to university and you do something, you start applying for jobs that are related to the thing you did in university. So never really asked those questions. And so for those 2 years we were working, learned a lot of valuable stuff about building our careers. We're like making pretty solid salaries for being like 21, 22 years old. But just that feeling of like, that this can't be all there is. And so if I had the context I have now, I might start to think about many different things that could be changed, could be improved. But at that point in time, I think for both of us, it was like, we had this clear image of spending time traveling and feeling super alive. And now it's like, we're making solid money so we can save money. And so why don't we just save money, quit, and go somewhere where we know that we can spend 6 months living off our savings, because that's the thing we do know. And it wasn't like the long-term thing. Obviously, there was lots of like question marks about what this was going to relate to our long-term plans, but it was just, okay, we know we feel great when we do this, and we know we don't like where we're at right now. So let's just go for it.
Yeah. And like, I think, Amanda, you kind of started to talk about a little bit around this next question, which is like, what was the hard part about making the decision to go into being like, yeah, we're digital nomading. We're going to go on the road and build careers around doing that?
Yeah. So I think, there's kind of like two parts to what was challenging with that. So one was like, actually figuring out how to do that and how to make money doing that, which took time. And then the other part was coming home from South America and being like, we're going to do something different now. And I don't think at that point, like this was the summer of 2014, we knew exactly what that looked like. I think our first plan was to go teach English in China. And I remember my parents being like, what? You're going to teach English in China? And we're like, we're moving out of Canada. We're going to go teach English in China. Because we knew we'd heard about that. We had seen people doing it while we were traveling. We knew you could make money doing that. So there was kind of like the two parts to it. One was like, we need to spend time figuring out how to actually do this, how to actually make money doing it, which took probably about a year and a half, 2 years from that point to actually kind of make happen. And then just kind of like over and over again with people who knew us from this kind of like old life that we were kind of, shifting from was letting them know like, hey, we're doing something different now. Because at that point we decided to come back to Canada and we decided to move to a mountain town. We got jobs in like retail and cafes. We were making minimum wage. We started a podcast. We were living very, very differently from how we had been previously. And I think that for a lot of people who knew us, it was kind of confusing. Like they didn't understand why we were doing that or if we were okay, or, a lot of people had opinions about this decision that we were making and whether it was right for us or not. And there was a lot of, hard conversations and kind of constantly just being like, I'm good. Like, just let me do my thing. Like, I promise you I'm fine. Like, just trying to make a change here. And I think that was really hard, especially being young. I think we were like 25 at the time. And it's just a hard age to, I think, kind of really stand in your own and be like, this is who I am and this is what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm. And like with the context of kind of saboteur and sage, like the two different ways you can motivate or see people motivating themselves or the stance that they're taking, how do you see that playing into how they were showing up or interacting with you when you're sharing something outside the norm about your decision making?
Yeah, I think this is probably different for both of us based on our, saboteurs and stuff. But I mean, for me, I was definitely living a lot in saboteur mode. So I saw, the judge come up a lot, like the judge of myself, for sure. The judge of others. So like when other people didn't necessarily understand it.
I'm just really curious about the judge of self. Like, how did that show up? Because I think it's a common thing for a lot of people that they're not as aware of.
Yeah, I think that for me, the judge of self shows up a lot when I feel like maybe other people are judging me. So it's like somebody judges me and then I reflect that on to myself, like not having the confidence to kind of stand in my own and be like, you are welcome to judge, but like, this isn't my thing that I'm going to take on. I think that especially at that point in time, as I was kind of like building confidence in myself and learning who I was, there was a lot of like somebody reflects their judgments on me. And then I kind of go into like this doubt mode of like, oh, maybe I'm not good enough, or maybe I'm not doing this right. Or, maybe I am making a mistake. Maybe I should just get a job in corporate, a lot of kind of judgments that I'm putting on myself. And similar to that, I mentioned the pleaser before. And I think the pleaser was a really hard one for me, having hard conversations with my parents and really good friends was hard as somebody who's like a perpetual people pleaser. It's like, you want people to like you, you want people to be happy with you. And when you have to have hard conversations, it's inevitable that like, they're not going to be happy with you because you're not doing what they want you to do. So I think those were ones for me for sure.
Yeah, I don't know what I'd say for other people. I feel like for me, going through that transition was very much about like just not building walls, but just like I'm not mentally thinking about kind of what anyone else is dealing with. I think maybe for my family, it was a bit of that feeling of like they want to make sure that I'm doing things that are kind of safe and taking kind of big risks, especially risks where they don't really see the upside because they come from a very different like frame of reference to, you know, the types of ways you can build a career today versus the ways you built a career 20, 30 years ago are very different. So they're, I think, coming from that position of like, oh, like we're a bit concerned, maybe we're a bit nervous about where this is going to lead, would be the biggest one.
Yeah. And one of the things I think that shows up for me, like whether it's becoming a digital nomad or being an entrepreneur or you're kind of taking the path less traveled, is I find a lot of people project their fears onto other people. So like they're nervous, they wouldn't do that. So their fear comes up and it kind of gets projected on you and they're worried for you. And it shows up as maybe trying to control or like push you or have you nudge in a different direction.
Yeah. I think one other thing as well, when you're growing up, depending on the type of person you are, of course, but I think both of us were very much people who did well along the conventional track of things. So our parents saw us go to university and do quite well in university, and then come out of university and get jobs that are in line with our, you know, the career track that it looked like we were on. And we weren't in relationships where we were communicating many of the things we were going through and feeling. And so for them, it's also just this harsh like change, like, oh, what I thought you liked what you were doing before, and now it's completely different. So it's a bit of that like surprise too, because it's not, you know, something they expected or saw coming.
Yeah. A little more jarring, which I think probably adds to like the fear or concern from somebody else's view. But I always just think it's really interesting to consider where some of that friction comes from. And a lot of it comes, like I find for myself anyways, I'll take it on as like oppositional, but it's just, again, their context of where they're coming from. And some of this stuff starts to shift and you start to see, oh, that's where you're coming from. And you don't get as sucked into that like position or conflict quite the same way.
Yeah.
For sure.
So one of the things that I've noticed anyways is a lot of people tend to have a pretty romantic notion of being a digital nomad. I've traveled for work and it was maybe a week or two. And it's like, it's hard to balance everything. With everybody moving to remote work, I think as COVID restrictions shift, I think more and more people will be on the road. What are some of the hidden downsides that people don't consider when they're diving into doing something like you guys do?
Yeah, I think that exactly what you mentioned, like the realities of having to work, which I think even we kind of, I guess, made that mistake like early on. Like we were used to with backpacking, like spending 3-4 nights in a place and we would just like go the whole time. And maybe spending a week somewhere would be like a long time. And when we first set out as digital nomads, we went to Asia and I think our first stop was Singapore. And so we booked a week in Singapore. We were like, awesome, a week will be great. We just want a couple days to explore, like kind of that 3-4 days. We can also work. And we were just like immediately like, this is not enough time if we're trying to like work full time basically. And we're also juggling like, you know, crazy hours being on the other side of the world from most of the people and clients we work with and that type of thing. And I think on that trip, we spent about 8 months in Asia, kind of bouncing around for different countries. I remember getting to Chiang Mai in Thailand, which is like such a classic digital nomad spot. And we had a month booked there and that was amazing. We were both like, this is great. Like we can spend our weekends doing things. We can get in really good habits, routines during the week. We can, cook a bit more. We can experience restaurants. We can find friends here. We can go to meetups. We have time to like do things like go to the gym or do yoga. So you're not losing like that part of things too. And I think from there on out, it was obviously, we had a lot of different travel plans, but we were basically like, at least 1 month in a place is kind of how we like to do things if we're going to be working full time. And obviously we travel to lots of places where we don't go for a month. Like we go for weekends or long weekends or, a week or two, but we adjust our work schedule. And I think that that's the biggest thing is like, it's not backpacking. It's not a vacation. It's not like a weekend trip. It's, working full time. So basically your normal life, but in a different place. I think that's probably the biggest thing I would say.
Yeah. And I think to get maybe a little bit more abstract, I have this idea that, and this is going to lead to the digital nomad thing, that all diets work when they're new diets. So for example, like when people started doing gluten-free, it forced everyone to eat real foods. And then slowly you can now get gluten-free cookies, gluten-free pizzas, gluten-free cereals. All those processed foods are back in gluten-free. And the same thing has happened with vegan. The same thing has happened with keto. And I think some of that is true with like how digital nomad life has evolved. So 10 years ago, when you started as a digital nomad, that kind of forced you into doing certain things. So that typically meant you had to become an entrepreneur. It meant you had to like find different opportunities, really be conscious of the way you were pursuing your professional life, as well as your just day-to-day life, getting to travel, getting to explore. You have to really be intentional about kind of all aspects of your life. Whereas I think today, as like communication technology has evolved and jobs have become more remote, like it's more easy to take all that negative stuff with you from home and just bring it somewhere else as well. So if you don't like your job and your life at home, moving to a different location might spice that up for a little bit, but all of those things are going to follow you along the way. So I do think people tend to view it a bit more as like a panacea of like, oh, if I could just do this from Thailand, that would be amazing. And it is kind of nice. The novelty's there. It's great to be able to kind of slowly explore places. But I think a big part of it as well is taking like a self-directed approach to life and kind of asking all those questions of where do I want to live? Do I live where I live just because of random circumstance? Where do I want to work? Do I work where I work just because it was like the easiest thing to do? And taking that full control, and that can be something you do when you're a digital nomad, which is amazing, but it can also not be. And then it's not going to be as fulfilling or interesting.
Yeah. Well, I really like that concept because it's something that I've noticed. I mean, I've been working from home forever. I've never actually had an office job, but working from home, work becomes home and home becomes work. And that was another question I had for you guys was like, does it change your picture of like what travel is, and how people perceive travel? Like, has it tainted it in a way, or have you been able to keep it separate enough so that you enjoy it as you did when you first traveled?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think it's just very different. And I think that going into it the first time, like I said, with Asia, I kind of had these like really glamorous expectations of what things would be like, oh, I can, take my laptop and sit by a pool or something like that. And then I'm like, oh no, I can't see the screen. My computer is going to die. It's overheating, it's near water. That's obviously a bad idea. There's all these things that are just not glamorous about it. So I think there was a moment of kind of like, oh, this isn't really what I expected. Like I kind of expected to get that same sort of like joy of travel, but be able to make money while doing it. And I think now after a number of years of doing this, we've both, I think, but at least for me, like found a really nice balance. And I kind of think of like being a digital nomad as like quite a different thing from being, I guess, like a traveler a little bit. Like I feel like when we go somewhere, we're traveling, and when we're kind of like nomading somewhere, it's more like we're living. And I think that both are really awesome. And I think that I actually really love the experience of being able to spend a month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, maybe more than that in a place. Like one of the first places we settled down in was Mexico City. We got an apartment for 6 months. And, had you asked me a decade ago if I would ever spend any time in Mexico City, I probably would have said, maybe a couple of days, and never would have considered myself living there. And I think it's really cool to get that experience, because you become like not just a traveler there, but you kind of, get to experience like the culture and the place a little bit deeper. So I think in my head now, I kind of think of them as like different things. And I think that was necessary for me to kind of not, I guess, like ruin this dream and this like nice picture that I had of travel in my mind. What about you?
Yeah, no, I just definitely echo that. I think that when you're first thinking about it, like when we were on that trip in 2014 and like travel was amazing, and we're thinking, well, it'd be great if we had this, but like without that sensation of seeing a savings account plummeting, it's just going to be the best. And then you start doing it and you're like, yeah, it's different. It's its own thing. We still really like it. I think for us, we've realized as well, like we like being in places for longer. I think this tends to be really the experience people go through. They start it and maybe they spend a year where they're going to like 12 countries in a year, sometimes even more. And then after that, you start to find some places, you start to find community. And then it's kind of those hubs where, you like to spend 3 to 6 months somewhere, 3 months somewhere, 6 months somewhere else, and kind of approach it like that, where you can kind of use it kind of like that hub idea of you've got your home base, you've got your place where you can work, and then you're going for adventures out from there. I think it's also really made us appreciate home as well. And we like to spend time where our families are and in Western Canada. And I think we've really grown to appreciate home and have a lifestyle there of like adventure and doing things and exploring that we never would have had we not spent so much time traveling elsewhere.
Yeah. Which is a good segue to my next question, which is, how has being on the road so much and living in all these different countries changed your perspective on life or on business? I know that might be a big question, but like it must shape how you see the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few different places I could take with it. I honestly and genuinely feel that this movement of, whether you want to call it like location independent people, I think digital nomad is kind of taken on some like douchebaggery. And so people are like trying to change the term now. But just the idea of location independent people, and more so like the economic dynamics. So if you look at a situation like, a country is just in economic turmoil, things are going really bad for that place. So often what's been able to keep that situation afloat is people have so many costs involved with leaving. You can't see your family anymore. Your economic opportunities disappear. And so what's happening is like these things that kind of bound us to certain kind of governments, nation states, that type of thing, have been weakened, because now the costs, like we can come live in Mexico, work opportunities don't change at all. We can stay in touch with our friends. We can stay in touch with our families as good, sometimes even better, than when we were in Canada. So I think it's made us kind of view where we're from differently. And this opportunity to spend more time in different places, you really get to know and see like, what's a culture like? What's different? People are more like abrupt in this way. They're more passive in this way. They do things. You just kind of get to know these other cultures, and you really, I think, can kind of see yourself a bit removed from your own culture in a way. I think for us, we get to see how people interact and do things in Mexico. We get to see how people did things in Asia or certain countries there, and how people are in Canada. So I think giving perspective on, culture and just how people are in different places has been a big thing.
Mm-hmm, for sure. And just to kind of tag on with that, I think being able to go and experience other cultures has just been a really important, like, developmental experience for me in terms of just understanding humans and understanding the way that the world works. And, we talk a lot about in like the program you did that we did with you, understanding kind of like sage and saboteurs and how those impact like human behavior and the way we interact with one another. And obviously there's a million different layers to a person. And I think that sometimes we can, get scared based on or feel uncertain or uncomfortable based on people dressing differently or speaking a different language or eating a different food or having a different religion or being a different skin color. And I think that when you travel places, and especially when you live places, so you spend a lot of time there, it's like you kind of recognize that, like, yes, we're different. Maybe we were brought up different. Maybe we speak a different tongue or we look different, but it's like we're all kind of just humans living this human experience. And I think when you kind of look on like the news or something, it's like the world seems like a very scary place that's like imploding. And my experience has always been like when I go somewhere, it's not like that. Like people are kind, people are generous, like people are just living their human experience. And, of course, there are dangerous situations and dangerous people and dangerous places. So we need to take precautions. I'm not saying just go out and, just be careless. But I think that really getting to experience that for ourselves is huge. It's a huge like growth opportunity.
And one quick thing I'd add, just thinking about Amanda saying that, is I feel like traveling puts you in contexts where people kind of like push your buttons differently. So when you grow up in Canada, there's kind of certain cultural norms which you understand. And then you go to a different country, those don't exist anymore. And our initial response is to get annoyed. So if you go to Germany, people kind of like bump into you all the time. And your initial response is like, what's going on?
And they don't say sorry.
And because in Canada, people say sorry, or like line culture is very different from country to country. And if someone's breaking the line culture, we feel frustrated and angry about it. But you can't take those feelings with you to Colombia because you're just going to be upset the entire time. Same thing goes with like personal space, some countries and all these other things. So it really does provide an opportunity for kind of introspection about these things that are going to make you upset, because you realize that like either I'm going to have to change or I'm going to have to go home, because this is just the way they do it. And nobody here cares. Nobody gets upset when people are doing it. Like if they're cutting lines or if they're cutting people off in traffic, whatever it might be.
Yeah. And I think that's such a great, like, I think of it as a tool that I use for myself. It's like, if I'm frustrated, what does that say about me? Because more often than not, we're always like, oh, that person's cut me off in traffic, they're a bad driver. And it's so easy just to like look at life that way instead of like, okay, what does that say about me if I get really upset if somebody like cuts me off? And how that shows up in different areas, whether it's travel or work or whatever it is.
Yeah. It's funny. We're driving here in Mexico, so I'm kind of getting used to and accustomed to driving here. And it's like everyone kind of, cutting people off isn't really like a thing here. It's just like, that's how people drive. So it's like, you just move. And so I'll be kind of nervous. Sometimes I'll get frustrated because someone like won't let me into a lane and I'll have to like force my way in, or vice versa, worried about, am I pissing someone off because I'm making like a big lane change? No, everyone's just like super zen. Like no one seems to have road rage, even though if you put like any driver from Canada or most places in America into these situations, you'd have like massive road rage.
Yeah, just similarly to that I'll add, I had a friend who asked, like, he was like, I'm pretty like rigid and controlled, more like type A. And he's like, do you have any tips for kind of working with that? And I was like, go to Southeast Asia or like go to South America. Because I feel like for me, that's kind of how I was like in my, late teens, my early 20s. And like Ryan said, it's like you can choose to be frustrated because your bus isn't on time or it's 4 hours late or it just didn't come. And they're like, sorry, the bus isn't coming today. And you're like, what do you mean the bus isn't coming? Like, I have a ticket, it has a time on it. Like I have a seat, like, where is the bus? But it's like, that's just how things work some places. And you can choose to be upset about it, or you can choose to be like, okay, I guess I'm doing something else today. And, those types of situations can just be inherently frustrating. But it's really about like how you choose to deal with them. And I think that being able to experience these different experiences just kind of teaches you to be like a more well-rounded, kind of calm Zen human in general.
Yeah. And like, so how does that show up for you? You mentioned you have the controller. part of, like, that's a saboteur that shows up for you. It sounds like the person you were talking with probably has a similar trait.
I would imagine so. Maybe some stickler.
So like, how does the controller show up for you? And like with travel and mental fitness, like bringing in some of the stuff that you've gone through in the program, like how has your understanding of how you show up changed, and what's different now that you've gone through the program, and how you navigate travel or things that frustrate you when you don't have your say in the matter?
Yeah. I mean, I think even kind of like prior to the program, when I had no idea what this was, I think it was just like recognizing that, you know, these things are happening and I can choose to be upset about it and kind of like ruin my day and, you know, ruin Ryan's day probably too, or whoever else I'm traveling with. Or I can just, you know, take a moment to feel the frustration that is real. Like, it's annoying that this train didn't come today, and then move on from it, because it's like, ultimately I can't do anything about it. Right. Like, there's only so much that's in our like realm of control that we can actually, you know, control. And I think a lot of times, like, the biggest thing that we can control in these situations is how we respond to it. And so I think that's kind of how I learned to approach it through travels. And then just like even more so with that through the program, and then understanding, okay, this is an actual thing that shows up for me. You know, the saboteur is like out there trying to like ruin my day essentially, and ruin other people's days. You know, how can I bring in like the sage mentality and maybe turn my day around? Like, maybe like, what could be the gift of your train not showing up? Like, maybe you have another day in this city and there's something you wanted to do, or maybe there's a really amazing restaurant right by the train station, or like a cool hotel you could stay in, or something like that. Like, I don't know what it is, but maybe there's a gift out of the whole situation.
Yeah. Trusting that something else could show up. That, yeah, makes it all worth it. And yeah, just, it's always like, travel is just one of those things. It's like having a younger sibling. Like, there's always something that's going to push your buttons. And yeah. I kind of think of it as an important experience to go through, and like tying it in with mental fitness stuff. It's like, you are purposefully putting yourself in situations where that's going to come up. So you get kind of, instead of just staying at home where everything's easy, you actually like grow that muscle to be able to handle those challenges with more grace and ease, which I think is like one of those things you don't really notice that you're getting from traveling until later.
Yeah. And something I'll just add quick, and I think we've both experienced this, is like, now we've spent so much time outside of Canada and other countries. Like, I find there's things about Canadian culture that drive me wild now when I go back. And that was, you know, never the case when I'd go on these like big trips, and then I'd come back and it'd be like, oh, thank God I'm home, you know, like clean drinking water and like the foods I'm used to, and we can speak English. And now it's like, I go home and I'm like, nobody's speeding, the speed limits are slow, nobody's jaywalking, why is everyone waiting for this walk sign? Like, nobody's being assertive in this situation. I'm like, come on, people, let's get things going here. I think Ryan can relate to that too.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So I'd love to chat a little bit more about mental fitness specifically. So you guys went through as a couple, which is not quite the norm. And I think it's a really cool, powerful move to kind of move through some of these concepts and see it at play with each other. How has it impacted your relationship and how you show up together?
That's a good, deep question. I think that, I guess the first thing I'd say, I think that just the concept of mental fitness is super valuable to think about. I think it's something that we both kind of like intuitively got, have been working on for a long time, but just like defining it like that, like we all get physical fitness. Like, it doesn't matter if you go to the gym like 10 years ago, if you stop going to the gym, you're going to get fat, and kind of approaching your mental fitness in the same way. And so I think for us, I think we found it valuable. One, just like both implementing kind of deeper mental fitness practices. I think having that understanding of our saboteurs and kind of understanding of each other's saboteurs, I think just going through it together kind of helped with just both getting a deeper experience of our own, because we can kind of talk about that, but also just understanding, oh, okay, this is the way that this person is going through something. I think this is something that's kind of more broad than just any one specific kind of model of mental fitness or whatever you want to call it. But understanding that like people are different, people have different stuff going on, and they have different stories that are coming from other places, because a really kind of like childish way of viewing the world is like, everyone should be exactly the same as I am. And if they're not, and they should be, if I don't get why they don't get it, that type of thing. So having that concept of what the saboteurs are, that shared language, I think is really helpful. I think it's, that's some of the stuff that jumps to mind. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that just being able to speak the same language about something is really helpful. And we've done a lot of, personal development and development as a couple. And I think this was one of the first things that we did like at the same time together. Like we've, read books or done courses or programs where we're like, hey, this would be really helpful. Can you learn this too? So we can like, speak the same language with this. And that's obviously been beneficial, but actually going through it together, I think was really helpful. And I think the reality of like being a human in a relationship is like, you're going to have conflicts, and you're going to have times where like the person that you spend all this time with is bothersome or annoying. And I think just being able to communicate that in a way that's not just like, you're annoying, it can be so much more positive, right? And then to also come at it from a place of like empathizing with that person, like maybe there's something going on with them, so maybe I could think about that and not just make it all about me. Because I think that conflicts come from this like individuals have these experiences, and they're both coming from it like, I've been wronged or I feel a certain way, and then it's like that conflicts, right? Because nobody's saying like, hey, I hear you, you're feeling something, like, tell me more about that in terms of how I can, be a part of that. And so I think that it's really just added another tool to our toolbox and how we can, handle conflicts and just understand each other and manage our communication.
So one of the things that I come back to a lot, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on this, is like some of the stuff that you shared, it sounds like common sense. It sounds like stuff that I've read in other books or in other courses. What made this different in terms of actual implementation, or like, how is it different? Because I think some people listening might be like, oh, I get those things. Like I do those things. But like for somebody that's already done other reading, learning, workshops, what was actually different about this?
I think the biggest thing would be that practice of doing kind of those PQ rep mini meditations throughout the day, and kind of having like a metric that you're working towards, as opposed to just like both of us having this idea of like, oh, it's really helpful if you're present, or like I should try to be more present in this situation. That's something that's when you're kind of your least present, you're least likely to realize that you're not present. And so just kind of having this like, okay, what does it mean for me to be kind of working towards being in a, I guess, getting out of saboteur mode would be doing the daily practice multiple times throughout the day. And then I think the model of like the saboteurs and the model of like shifting out of that saboteur mode towards like sage mode are both really valuable. It's kind of like a combination of like a few different ideas of that, like, that personality type combined with like an actual practice of doing things. So that's kind of what comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I think that like having, the app and the reminders, but then also having, like the group coaching aspect where we were able to come together every week and kind of talk about what we were going through. So it's like most of what I've done in terms of personal development has been through like a book or like a course, or like, I did like a group kind of course on nonviolent communication, but it was with a group of people. Like it wasn't like with my partner, it was like with a group of people that, sure, we practice these situations, but it's not as relevant to me because I'm not doing it with somebody who's like, I'm actually having the conflicts with. And yeah, most personal development I've done and mental fitness type stuff I've done has been really like self-directed. And I think having that group experience and then also that like accountability daily through the app was helpful. And just to get into your point about like common sense, like, yes, it sounds like common sense, but the thing is that common sense goes out the window when you're in saboteur mode and when you're in conflict. So it's like, you can say, hey, yeah, like me and my partner have great communication, or like me and my boss have great communication. But when you're feeling at like the height of frustration with somebody, it's like, can you come to that perspective of like understanding them or understanding what you're feeling? And that's like the hard work. Like that's what we're practicing for. It's kind of like we're training for like the Olympics.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things, like, you guys both have a unique window into, Amanda with your podcast, talking with people in the yoga space, Ryan, and both of you worked at Praxis at one point, but like talking to other people going through challenges and navigating their careers and jobs and stuff like that. Like, what do you see as themes or patterns that people struggle with the most? More specifically, like their blind spots. Like, is there a pattern or theme that you see with, say, at Praxis, like this younger group trying to get into the workforce, as a blind spot and where they struggle?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the very first thing that comes to mind is just that like vision and kind of desire and motivation, which is kind of interesting and kind of, from a certain perspective, a little bit sad. So to context, Praxis is a group of like some of the best young people that are out there. Everyone in there is very goal-oriented, self-directed, has a vision for what they want to accomplish in their career. So this isn't as much of a challenge there, but we interview a ton of people and only accept a very small amount in the program. And just what you see is like, so many people kind of view their careers and their life from a disempowered point of view. When like life is such like an awesome gift that we have, like there's so many possibilities. You can move to any country in the world, basically. You can do all sorts of different jobs. Like you can go work on safaris or learn how to scuba dive. Like there's so many possibilities. And somehow kind of, whether it's culture, norms, whatever, so many people arrive at these points where they're like 20 years old. And it's like, what do you want to do? It's like, I don't know. Like, it feels like there's no options when we've got a bazillion options. And so kind of one of the biggest things is, I think, that thing that kind of stands out as like something that really separates people is just having a vision for the future that you're excited about and care about. I think that definitely comes to mind as a big one. And then I think a second thing kind of more related to that is we view work in a very strange way for the most part. Work is like a very important part of your life, right? Like that's how you're generating an income. That's literally what your survival on earth is dependent about. It's going to be your life's work. It should be something important to you. It shouldn't be something where you leave work and you're like, that sucks. I don't want to talk about that ever with my friends. Like that's a kind of a terrible approach to life in general. That might be a bit judgy way to say it, and what a job is just this relationship, right? Like you're agreeing to help someone and if someone's agreeing to paying you, it's a trade, it's a win-win deal. And so just putting yourself in the perspective of like, how do you get hired? Well, you get hired when you can create value for someone. And okay, I need to be able to create value for someone and show I can create value for someone. And that means you can find opportunities all over the place and find creative ways to win those opportunities. But so often people kind of take that disempowered view with work of, oh, I need to get someone to grant me this opportunity, or the government needs to raise the wage, or else I can't raise my own wage. So those two things of one, just like having a vision for the future and something you're excited about, and two, recognizing your own power to create your own opportunities, I think are the positive side of what really separates great people and are what kind of holds a lot of people back.
How do you cultivate that? Like, how do you, like, it's one for somebody that has it, it's like they get it. But for somebody that's feeling lost, they're like, I don't know what to do. Like, like, how do you go about cultivating that level of vision and excitement for what's to come? Like, is there anything personally that you guys do in the past, like to build on that, or people that you've seen that have a way to keep that alive and a bit of even a process around it? I don't know.
Yeah, I think that it's very hard to do. And I think especially in the context of like, if you're working in a situation where you need someone to have this thing to work with them, usually it's better to say like, hey, you need to kind of go on this journey and maybe we'll meet again in the future if you're in the right place. Because it's something I think is very hard to kind of light that spark for someone else. Someone else has to, turn it on for themselves. I think for us, we both went through that experience. Like, I think if you met us at 22, you might think the same thing. Like, I probably would think the same thing of myself. It's like, what do I want to do with my life? I don't know. Like, I'm making like a decent salary and I'm kind of unhappy and I'm not really like, don't have like a vision for the future. And for us, it was travel. I think for most people, we have a really good understanding. There's something that kind of like haunts us. There's this great episode of a podcast. It's on Theo Vaughn, who's a comedian's podcast, and Mike Posner, who is that guy who like took a pill in Ibiza song. He also has this song Cooler Than Me, which was like a one-hit wonder a long time ago. And a couple of years ago, he actually walked across America and got bit by a snake, had this whole journey. A great interview, great story. But he kind of talks about how we all have something that we want to do. And I think this is almost universally true. So for me, it was like, I want to travel. Like, I want to go places. Like, I want to see places I saw in movies. Some people, it's like, I want to write a book. Some people, it's, I don't know, I want to
be an actor,
like all these things. And I think the most important thing is just like trying to do that thing, because most of the time you're going to realize that like, oh, that's not the most important thing. And you're going to be on to the next thing, but it's just starting down that path is going to help you realize where you want to go and kind of give your brain the permission to let go. But just kind of starting to do those things that you want to do and worrying less about what everyone else thinks. And so that you can kind of cultivate that sense of, okay, there's possibilities here. I can move to whatever's next.
Yeah. And just to add to that, I mean, I think that this is like a very personal internal journey. And so to answer your question about like, what can I do for somebody else? Like, I mean, I can give somebody tools to help them, but I can't do it for them. And I can't light that spark for them. It's like, I could give them some like kindling to build their fire, but it's like, they need to like get the fire going. And I think that's the thing that's hard, is because I think sometimes like society sort of snuffs out our fire a little bit. And it's like, how do we get that spark? How do we find it? And especially if we are burdened by, debt or, societal circumstances, or we're working so much, we're tired, or maybe you've like are a single parent or something like that. Like, there can just be these situations where I think you can feel like starting that spark is impossible. But I think that, there's a lot of resources out there. There's a lot of like, books you can read and podcasts you can listen to, and just trying to see like if somebody can help you sort of start like get that going, like figure out what that thing is that really makes you want to get up in the morning, and then see if every day you can kind of cultivate that feeling until like that spark goes. And then you can bring in other people like, coaches and other tools and resources to really like build that into, I guess, like a fire, to continue with my metaphor.
Right. And one last thing that came to mind is Isaac Morehouse, who was one of the people who started Praxis, has kind of since moved on to other projects. He has a book called Don't Do Stuff You Hate. And one of the kind of core ideas of just like his career building, life building philosophy is just don't do stuff you hate. Like, that's simple. So start doing a bunch of stuff and stop doing the stuff you hate. Sometimes we have to do stuff that we don't like, but kind of knowing that difference, and just, if you hate your job, quit your job. Like, that's kind of the most important thing. Having a bunch of money in your savings account is much less important than not hating your job. Find a job you hate less and just kind of keep doing that. And it usually takes you in the right direction.
I think that was really like a part of our journey that was key, like that coming back from South America and recognizing, okay, that situation we were in before, we don't want to be in again. And we don't know exactly where we're going yet. So let's find something that will like pay the bills and keep us financially afloat, while giving us like a lot of time outside of work to explore what we wanted to do. And that's really where like moving to a mountain town and like working in retail and at a cafe for minimum wage came to, because it's like, okay, I can work at Lululemon and make like $12.50 an hour. And, you know, I'm certainly not rolling in dough over here, but it's like, I can pay my rent, I can buy my groceries, and I don't have a job that's so stressful that I come home and, you know, my spark is snuffed out. It's like, I've got time to like cultivate that and work on that and try things and read books and, you know, do different things and whatnot. And in fact, like, I feel like that's probably one of the most fun jobs I ever had. Like, you know, it wasn't about the money. It was about creating time and space in my life to discover what was next for me. And, you know, I ended up actually having a job that I thought was quite fun. And I think you probably feel the same way too.
Yeah, it was funny. We went from like jobs that paid us very well and were kind of seen from around us as like being very, not like the most, but like very like, okay, this is like a great professional job. Okay, awesome. 2 jobs. Like I was serving, but it's funny because like serving, I was making like basically as much money if you kind of consider the tax implications of the whole situation, had a lot more free time, and it allowed me to pursue other things. Although people kind of like maybe turned their nose up and were like, oh, you really like lost the plot or like gone off track. Yeah. That was like one of the best moves.
Yeah. It's such an interesting, so I just want to share, like, just hearing you guys talk about and answer the question that I asked, what came up for me is surrounding yourself with people that are doing things differently, because hearing you talk about it lit my fire again. And I think that's one of the key things is like, if you're stuck on your own, like surround yourself with people that you want to cultivate in yourself. Like they have those traits, they're doing some of those things. And there's the being and the doing side of things. It's like you can read all you want and conceptually understand how to do things, but it's that step to taking action that a lot of people miss the boat. Like they don't take that leap. When you look at, say, praxis or for yoga, like you're talking to yoga studio owners or people in the yoga space, my guess is there's a lot of people about to take a leap of some kind. What, in your experience, has been the thing that held you back the most from taking the leap, or like the biggest kind of doubt or fear that came up prior to that leap? Because it's usually the scariest part. It's like when you're about to do something, that's when your saboteurs and your survivor brain kicks in. It's just like, what are you doing? This doesn't make sense. And like the logic comes out and you're trying to logic your way through this. What was the hardest part about taking that step?
Yeah, I think for me, it was like a combination of fear of failing and then like fear of judgment. So, and fear of judgment kind of comes into play with fear of failing, because I'm not really like that scared of people judging me if I like make $1 million, you know, like it's kind of this like, oh, if I do something that's outside the norm and I take this leap and then I stumble and I fall on my face and like knock my 2 front teeth out, like that's going to be embarrassing. And then I'm kind of scared of like what people will think from there.
Yeah, I think for me, I think back to that decision to quit our jobs and go traveling. And that was something that, so going traveling after university in Canada is not like, not everyone does it, but like it's fairly like common, accepted thing to do. Quitting your job 2 years later to go traveling, especially like 7-8 years ago, like not really that common, and much more of a thing that's like, huh? What are you doing? And I remember at the time reading an article about like how if you have a gap on your resume that can like impact your future earnings by like, you know, whatever, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And also, yeah, just having these worries of like, oh, what if we come back and I can't get another job? Like, am I going to be homeless? Like I actually like had that thought of like, oh my God, like what's going to happen? And it was just kind of, yeah, having that. For me, honestly, it was just being pushed into like a dark enough place that I was like, I don't care. Like, I just need to get out of here. and make another move. I honestly think it's something I've thought about over time. If things had just been like better, like if I had been making more money, or my initial job had provided me with more of a feeling of like status, I think I could have been like pushed down this track for a lot longer without feeling like I need to get off. So I feel like kind of grateful in a way that like the first 2 years of my like traditional career kind of ground to a halt, because it allowed me to see so many more things and get to such a better place.
Yeah. Finding the gift. And it's sometimes it takes 2 years to see it, the gift for what it is, or the opportunity that comes up. And something that I always come back to, it's like, if I'm frustrated, if I'm worried, if whatever it is, it's like, okay, what's the gift in being in that space, which is from mental fitness. It's like the sage perspective, and it's hard to do and it takes time, but to flip something on its head and look at it through a different lens, I find that's where I have some of the biggest breakthroughs of like where I'm at in the business. Like, oh man, like this sucks. I don't have this. I don't have that. I don't have this. And then thinking, what if this is the biggest gift, or like the best thing that's ever happened to me by going through these things that suck?
Yeah. It's one thing that kind of ties back to travel for us, because actually two things I wanted to just quick hit on tying back to travel. You mentioned just the people and being around people. And I think that's one of the most important things about travel. I think that people kind of get kind of caught up in this sometimes, where people will be like, oh, everyone wants to travel, like, these dumb like Generation Z or millennials or whatever. And it's like, obviously travel is like a huge thing. You can have widely different experiences. But for us, those early days were going to different hostels, like moving around the world. And it wasn't so much about where we were, but the people we were meeting. So meeting people doing all sorts of stuff really kind of opened our perspectives. And the second thing is, when you kind of go and are venturing and coming back and staying at hostels, you almost never talk about like how pleasant things were. Like, you sit back down at the bar at the hostel at the end of the day and you're like, oh yeah, we went to the beach. It was beautiful. It's awesome. It's great. Oh, you guys are going there. You should go here. And that kind of conversation ends. But like, we were in Bolivia and had this like absolutely disastrous tour where like we almost got like a massive car crash. And those are the stories that really have legs and that go places. And it really helps you kind of start to reframe those moments, so that in the moment this bad stuff's happening, you're like, oh, this is going to be such great fodder for conversations later, and helps you, like you said, get into that sage perspective, see the gifts that are in things.
Yeah. So I was going to do a quick thunder round to wrap this up. And
sounds good.
Yeah, not a lightning round, a thunder round. If you could have everyone in the world read one book or have one similar experience, what would you want them to do and why?
Experience travel, like travel anywhere outside of your home country, and book The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem by Nathaniel Branden.
So experience is going to be specific to 2021. I think what I want to do is get everyone out to a gigantic music festival where everyone's respecting everyone's personal space. Maybe there's a bit of like empathetic substances that people can take, and we can all just get comfortable being around people again, physical touch, just like get out of the fear mindset, get out of our like little bubbles and into personal contact again. I think that'd be great. A book, the first one that came to my mind was 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem, which Amanda mentioned. So I'm going to think of a different one. And I think for me, what comes to mind as a great impactful book, maybe I'll say Atlas Shrugged. I think that's an awesome, interesting book, somewhat controversial depending on who you're hearing from. But it's a story fiction, covers a lot of like deep insights into kind of some of the things that like hold us back from achieving things in life.
Thank you. And what's the one most important thing that you need to hear over and over and over again and remind yourself of often in this entrepreneurial space? Like, Ryan, I know you're working again, but you were in entrepreneurial space. What's the most important thing that you have to hear over and over again, or tell yourself over and over?
I think one thing that's like kind of a regular mantra for me is just that like I'm perfectly imperfect. It's like I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to screw up. There's going to be times where it doesn't feel like it's working. And that's all part of it. And that's okay. Because I think we want things to feel good, right? But entrepreneurship is peaks and valleys, and you have to go through the valleys to get to the peaks. And I'm just consistently like, I'm perfectly imperfect the way that I am.
I think what comes to mind for me is just keep fighting. I think that for me, just kind of this realization of kind of if you're working hard and you're working on a big challenge, days are going to be messy and there's going to be kind of like things broken around you and like systems that need fixing. And that's kind of how you know you're in a good place. Because if everything works fine and you're never really pushed outside of your comfort zone, that's probably not the best, even though it feels great kind of day to day, it's like not the best place to be in. And so just waking up in the morning and thinking like, how can I make today 1% better? What can I do to keep things improving, keep getting off the mat and keep fighting.
Yeah. Great. Thank you so much. This has been a ton of fun, getting to hear your stories and chat about travel and everything. Where can people check you guys out? Where can they listen to your shows? What is the name of the shows? I want to give you some space just to kind of share what you guys are up to, and for people that are interested, where they can find you.
Yeah, for sure. So anywhere you're listening to this podcast, you can find our podcast. So the one we do together is called The World Wanderers. And then mine is called Mastering the Business of Yoga. So if you're a yoga teacher, studio owner, interested in the business of yoga, you can check that out. And then you can also find us at theworldwanderers.com or The World Wanderers podcast on Instagram, Facebook, all of those good platforms. And we both have personal websites that I think are maybe slightly outdated, but you can find me also at amandakingsmith.com and Ryan at, what is yours?
RyanAFerguson.com. And one other thing I'd add, if you're an entrepreneur who's looking to hire someone and interested in hiring someone who's young, ambitious, incredibly smart, has all the right ideas about approaching work, check out Praxis at discoverpraxis.com. There's lots of apprentices looking for opportunities there.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Fyfe.
Thanks, Fyfe.
See ya.